Okay, in the second part of today's content on nature and the separations between nature and culture and the way that becomes embedded in our consumer experiences, I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways that theme parks in particular package things up, and then there's almost been a reaction against the kind of dominance of these pre-packaged experiences where people kind of crave notions of authenticity, but again how that's increasingly rare and how those things are packaged up as well. So again, relating to the first half of the lecture, the tourist gaze has given us a way of thinking about how our experience when we go overseas in particular, and how we kind of gather around quite often, particular places, tourist nodes. They're kind of heavily promoted and regulated through the tourist industry. These things package and funnel tourists towards specific places, and signs there in this semiotic sense that socially construct their so-called authentic experience. Now, interesting here, this argument leads to the idea that when we are being a tourist, that we're kind of collecting experiences, collecting images and things like that, just like people say collect records or collect stamps. Here the notion of, we're in what the theorist calls processes of semiosis. All tourists in this sense become amateur semioticians, and remember I discussed semiotics earlier in the course. And what we're doing when we're out, being a tourist, is we're collecting and deciphering signs to construct and legitimate authentic natural experiences of them. And the way that we collect those signs is we do it through taking photos, increasingly taking film with our iPhones and stuff, and the buying of mementos and keepsakes and artworks and stuff like that. Now, importantly here, that collection of experiences endlessly reproduces the gaze, because if you're looking at the world through a camera, from this kind of tourist gaze argument, you are heavily embedded within that gaze. You are part of it, I suppose. All of this process is done through the gaze by the tourist and relates to the relationships between self and social identity. So again, here we want to create a self-identity through, collecting experiences, but we also then use that in terms of social identity in the way we want other people to think about us. So I think that's a really interesting way to think about tourism, as a collection of experiences. And certainly things like themed nature parks are almost like the extreme hyper-real example of it. These places here, you're talking about like things like SeaWorld and zoos and stuff like that. They standardize nature, they simulate it, they package it up, they virtualize it, they commodify it. They're kind of almost perfect examples, I think, of many aspects of Jean Baudelard's idea of simulation. So like shopping malls or sports stadiums, they're kind of unreal places, but they're kind of presenting so-called real nature in digestible and palatable bite-sized forms. You can go and see the lion or the polar bear or whatever, and there's no danger in that sense. You can see the actual thing, but in terms of the authentic experience, the danger and risk is taken out of it. You don't necessarily have to travel large distances to the other side of the world to do it. And, you can go back to the hotel and kind of go on with normal just after it. So in this sense, our dreams and fantasies about nature, whether that's notions of beauty, whether that's notions of danger, all these kind of things are sold back to us, packaged up for profit. They also invoke notions of education and conservation in these theme parks. So there's often, plaques to tell you, about the animal. There'll be kind of shows you can go to where the expert will tell you, about the, dolphins or, killer whales or something in the wild or whatever, and how they live. They often kind of talk about conservation as well, but you've probably seen many of the documentaries about these places, how the animals themselves aren't necessarily treated that well. Also, there's a distortion, a kind of simulation going on here in terms of what's Franklin called the zoological gaze. And I think it's a good example in the book about that, the ways that, in penguin facilities in particular, there's only a few of them in there, because there was this kind of assumption that if they were, put in there by the hundreds, which is kind of the way they live in that kind of crowded sense that people would be offended by that. They would actually start thinking that the zoo was being cruel if they were kind of being in this heavily crowded pen. So this is a kind of virtualization going on of nature, and it's certainly experienced increasingly outside of nature parks. You can see shops that kind of draw on the notion of nature increasingly to sell us stuff, and things like the Body Shop and Australian Geographic shops that are quite common in shopping malls as well. So, is it possible that people in our culture have become so estranged from nature that our only avenue towards it is through consumerism? And so these are kind of analyses of themed nature parks. These are the questions they bring up. Whether, there's no such thing as nature anymore, and whether it's actually just kind of sold to us in bite-sized pieces at a quite expensive price. Another aspect of this is the way that nature is simulated through scientific processes, through GM foods, the patterning of seeds, chemical fertilizers, animal testing, all that kind of stuff, that draws nature into processes of production that then has fundamental effects on nature itself. We don't really know what genetically modified food do to us. The patterning of seeds has led to kind of farmers having to buy seeds all the time rather than just being able to use the ones that were produced from the plants the year before. Chemical fertilizers that are meant to kind of make, growing food more efficient have all kinds of detrimental effects on waterways. And then there's the ethics of animal testings when it comes to, creating the safety of our products. Again, here nature is something that's separated from culture, or it's packaged up to us, or it's kind of exploited in the need to produce goods. Now, what seems to have happened as kind of things like nature parks and zoos become the key way of experiencing it is there was a kind of almost resistant desire through the 80s and 90s where people increasingly wanted to get back to nature. They want to escape and relax, and this is a romantic view of getting out there, going out of the bush, going camping, going to resorts and stuff like that. At the same time, there's a growing market to consume authentic, again in inverted commas here, indigenous cultures. Ironically, at the time where there's not many of them left, and it seems that what often happens in these situations too, again in terms of that tourist gaze, in terms of the way these things are packaged up, is what often happens here is that authentic indigenous culture is presented to us in a way that suits our Western tourist gaze. And this is seen as a kind of real problem in terms of post-colonial relations, where those indigenous cultures themselves may be distorted and threatened through those processes, particularly if they become profitable. So fantasies and myths of contact with authentic nature are seductive, but they're kind of unrealistic, and again, most of the way that we experience these things are packaged up for us through various tourist, industry and tourist services. So we feel like we're kind of given access to backstages here, the authenticity, but really we're witnessing front stage performances, what McConnell has called staged authenticity. And interesting here, another reaction to that is the idea of the post-tourist that Chris Rojek writes about, who actually has no real concern about authenticity or packaging or staging, and tends to see the kind of almost ironic experience of those things as an end in itself, something to be enjoyed. Okay, so I've been discussing here the kind of nature-culture dichotomy and how it's packaged up into kind of simulated consumer experiences. There's been a kind of quite a few very prominent social theorists that have been writing about the ways that the separation between nature and culture is really problematic. So I mentioned here, Baudrillard in particular, where the so-called real is replaced by simulation and hyperreality. But others like Bruno Latour and Donna Haraway and Frederick Jamison have all postulated that the assumed dichotomy between nature and culture no longer exists, as if it really did. And this has been particularly the case since the rise of climate change, where the irony here is that our efforts to separate ourselves from nature by, building power stations and consuming meat and all that kind of stuff seems to be sowing the seeds of the kind of very threat to the civilization in terms of the way that we live, and that we increasingly need to see ourselves as embedded in nature rather than separated from it to be able to solve those problems if those problems are still solvable. So again here I think a quote here kind of engages with some of this quite well. Ironically then, many of the experiences that contemporary Americans most readily identify with nature, things like mountain views seen from conveniently located lookouts, graded trails traversed along gurgling streams, great national parks like Yosemite visited with reservations made months in advance, could equally be considered simulation. That kind of need to go back to nature is often seems to be a simulation in and of itself as well. Now, this wouldn't be so problematic if it didn't seem to lead us to kind of, those notions that we're dominating nature. These notions of hyperreality and simulation are kind of fine, I suppose, in some senses, if they provide us with pleasure, if they're not too destructive, if they're not, treating the animals too badly. But it's kind of becomes politically problematic when we realise that we actually need what we consider nature, at least elements of it, such as, water, air and food to live. So in a risk society with these huge social problems like peak oil and climate change and water scarcity and the threats to food production and security in the future and pollution and that kind of stuff, the idea here is that we need to re-embed culture back into nature. We need to destroy that dichotomy that we've kind of constructed over the past couple of centuries. Otherwise, many kind of social theorists and scientists argue that our way of life is completely unsustainable. As a kind of alternate point of view here, we can kind of ask how much do we want to actually be in nature? And I've got a kind of story there written by the ecofeminist Val Plumwood, who writes about her experience of being attacked by a crocodile. It's a really great piece of writing, those things, you should check it out, particularly the one Being Prey, where she talks about how, as a kind of ecofeminist who thought, she was fairly cognizant of these problems, was really kind of faced with her, socially constructed separation from nature when during this experience where she started to think about, like, how can I be food? That's not fair, I'm a human, when she was being attacked by this crocodile. So again here, this I think is, it's just an example here of the kind of shocking indifference that we have to nature, except when we're, in these kind of really risky situations. The last thing I want to touch upon is this idea that is also increasingly kind of come about, where that people try and distinguish themselves, again a key form of Borgesian distinction here I think, as travellers, that they're not tourists, that they're travellers. And this itself becomes a way, has all kinds of problematic notions as well, that people try and disassociate themselves from tourists, even though that's exactly what they are. And again, they seem to kind of reappropriate and reproduce many of these kind of problematic tourist gaze things while trying to make that separation. And again, when you talk to people about going overseas, right, they'll often say stuff to you like, oh, don't go there, that's where all the tourists goes, go here, and that kind of stuff, as a way of, forming distinction, I suppose, and a way of trying to chase out more authenticity. So again, the kind of, the lecture note page there goes into that in some detail. Okay, so in conclusion, the notion of the separation between nature and culture is really problematic. Again, it's a social construction, and much of the way that we experience the very idea of nature here is in inverted commas, is really packaged up and sold to us in this kind of more digestible form. So we'll look at kind of the impact on nature of consumer culture later in the course, particularly when we look at waste. And this week's work has tried to make the normal look strange, to get us to rethink the kind of dichotomy between culture and nature, and to critically engage with the very practices of tourism itself. Okay, thanks.